And joining me now is John Kirby, National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications. John, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Good to be with you.
Thank you for being here. I want to start with the very latest. This ceasefire fell apart early Friday. Fighting has resumed. Israel, of course, has withdrawn from negotiations in Qatar. Can you give us a sense this morning? What is the status of negotiations to resume a temporary truce?
Well, there are no official negotiations going on right now, Kristen, and that's because Hamas failed to come up with yet another list of women and children that could be released, and we know they're holding additional women and children, not combatants, not female IDF soldiers, but innocent civilians, women and children that they have that they couldn't put on a list and turn that in. So unfortunately, the negotiations have stopped. That said, what hasn't stopped is our own involvement trying to get those back on track and trying to discuss with those partners and all those interlocutors, see if we can't get it back in place.
So those discussions have halted. What is the potential timeline to get them back on track, John?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that one. What I can tell you is that we are still working it really hard, hour by hour, to see if we can't get the sides back to the table and see if we can't get something moving. We would like that to happen today, but honestly, I just don't know.
All right. Well, let me ask you about Secretary Blinken's trip to the region this week. He said the Israeli government has agreed to a, quote, clear plan for averting civilian deaths before resuming its assault on southern Gaza. Can you give us an indication? What is that plan, John, and what specific assurances has Israel given to the U.S.?
I want to be careful that I don't speak to Israeli military operations and get ahead of what they're doing. That would be inappropriate for me to do. What I can tell you is that in our conversations with them, they have said that they agree with our idea here, that the approach they take matters, that the reduction of civilian casualties and, quite frankly, minimizing damage to civilian infrastructure is important to them, that they understand that. They're receptive to that message. And again, without getting ahead of their tactics, I can tell you that we saw them go in with less force when they went into the north. We're seeing them now conduct what we would call shaping operations in other places and making preparations. But they have actually given civilians in Gaza a list, a map. It's online, where a list of areas where they can go to be more safe. There's not too many modern militaries in advance of conducting operations that would actually do that. So they are making an effort to at least inform the civilian population about where to go and where to avoid.
I'm going to ask you about that map momentarily, but what is the United States prepared to do if it feels as though Israel is not following a specific plan to mitigate civilian casualties? What's the fallout?
That's a hypothetical, and I don't want to get ahead again of where we are right now. Secretary Blinken was very clear. We've been clear actually from the beginning of this conflict.
But will there be consequences, John, if the United States feels as though Israel is not following a specific plan?
You know, again, I don't want to speculate one way or the other, Kristen. I want to make two things clear. One is we're going to continue to support Israel as they go after Hamas. The security assistance continues to flow. That's not going to change. We're also going to do everything we can to make sure that they are properly accounting for the civilian population and minimizing the damage and the casualties as much as possible. The other thing that we're not going to take our foot off the gas on is seeing if we can get another pause in place so we can get more hostages out and, just as critically, more aid in.
Let's talk about this map that you have referenced, the fact that Israel has said these specific places are safe zones. Obviously, civilians were already told to evacuate from the north. There's a sense that these civilians don't have a place to go. A UNICEF spokesperson tells the Washington Post, quote, there is nowhere to move to. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. What is your response to him and others?
Well, we understand the anxiety and the fear there. I mean, not only are there still a lot of civilians in southern Gaza, there are more civilians in southern Gaza because the Israelis accounted for humanitarian corridors to get hundreds of thousands. So we're estimating more than about 1 million. So that's roughly half the population of Gaza before the war is now internally displaced. That's a lot of people. And so we understand the concerns by the UN and by other non-governmental humanitarian organizations in there. That's why, again, we're working with our Israeli counterparts to do everything they can to provide these areas where people can go and feel a sense of safety. And again, they did put some information out in the last 24, 48 hours to articulate those kinds of areas. That's a step in the right direction.
All right. Well, as we have discussed, the civilian death toll in Gaza has just been staggering. And despite all of this, only 1/5 of Hamas's fighters have been killed. Is Israel's goal of eradicating Hamas a realistic one?
We know from our own experience, Kristen, that while you can't defeat an ideology necessarily, you can certainly make it much more difficult for a group to operate, resource, train, plan, conduct attacks by going after their leadership. Certainly going after their sources of funding, and we've laid additional sanctions on Hamas ourselves, but going after their leadership has a deleterious effect on their ability to operate. And that is what Israel is focusing on. And they have taken out, in fact, in just the last 24 hours, taken out yet another leader of Hamas, a battalion commander, and they're going to go after others. We think that that is certainly a useful tactic to pursue.
Let's talk about the hostages. There are still 8 Americans who are unaccounted for, including one woman. Has the U.S. been able to obtain information about the whereabouts, the conditions of these hostages? Are they still alive?
We have imperfect information. We do believe that there are still a number of Americans that are being held hostage, Kristen, and we're getting that from communication with the family members and, of course, our Israeli counterparts. But it's difficult for us to know where they all are. And just as critically, Kristen, it's difficult for us to know what their condition is.
Well, the relatives of the hostages are demanding that the Red Cross get in to be able to assess their condition. That was a part of the plan. And Jake Sullivan told me a week ago he expected the Red Cross to get in within a day or so of our interview. That still hasn't happened. Why not? When is it going to happen?
That's Hamas. Hamas agreed to allow the Red Cross access to these hostages while the pause was in place. And, of course, that didn't happen and it's still not happening. And it's unacceptable. I want to say one thing. This really doesn't get to your question. But even though the pause fell apart, and even though there aren't hostages getting out, and even though, to your point, the Red Cross isn't getting in either, what we are still doing is working with the Israelis to get humanitarian assistance in. They have agreed to a continued flow. And so the one thing that hasn't stopped is humanitarian assistance, including fuel getting to the people.
But are you satisfied with the amount of humanitarian assistance getting in? Because it's lower than during the pause.
Of course not. No, it needs to be much more. And what we want to see, the ultimate goal, is to try to get it at least to the level it was, the upper level that it was during the pause. So we had several hundred trucks going in, sometimes several hundred a day. And so that's what we want to get up to.
John, I have to ask you about this New York Times reporting, which found that Israeli officials received Hamas's specific attack plan over a year ago. Was the United States aware of this intelligence? And if not, why not?
The intelligence community has indicated that they did not have access to this document. There's no indications at this time that they had any access to this document beforehand.
Should they have, given how closely U.S. and Israeli intelligence officials coordinate or are supposed to coordinate?
Intelligence is a mosaic, and sometimes, you can fashion things together and get a pretty good picture. Other times, that there's pieces of the puzzle that are missing. As I said, our own intelligence community said that they've looked at this. They have no indications at this time that they had any advance warning of this document or any knowledge of it.
John, very quickly, was this a failure on the part of Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence?
I think there's going to be a time and a place for Israel to do that sort of forensic work. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu's already spoken pretty candidly about this and calling it, a failure on their part. They'll take a look at this at the right time. They need to do that. Right now, though, the focus has got to be on making sure that they can eliminate this truly genocidal threat to the Israeli people.
All right. John Kirby, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.